بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين وصلوات ربي وسلامه على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. وبعد, to continue inshallah with the kitab أسرار الصيام from المهذب من إحياء علوم الدين by حجة الإسلام Abu Hamid al-Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala. And as has been mentioned before, the muhadhib, the person who has abridged it, his name is Sheikh Salih al-Shami. And so we have come to the chapter Al-Fasl al-Awwal في الواجبات والسنن واللوازم بإفساده. So that which is obligatory and that which is sunnah and that which is consequential to one breaking their fast. So he says al-wajibatu al-zahira. So we have wajibat which are zahir, that which are relevant to the outer. So this book, it focuses on the outer and the inner, but more so on the inner. And so he starts by talking about that which is obligatory upon us, i.e. outwardly. So he says, al-awwalu muraqabatu awwali shahri Ramadan. It is to look out for the beginning of the month of Ramadan. وذلك برؤية الهلال فإن غم في استكمال 30 يوما من شعبان. So he says it is to look for the hilal, so look for the crescent moon of Ramadan. And if it's not possible to see it due to al-gham, so due to al-ghuyum, the clouds covering the sky, etc., then a person will complete Sha'ban as 30 days, which we know as a practice, alhamdulillah. And then he says, وَنَعْنِ بِالرُّؤْيَةِ الْعِلْمِ. And he says, we mean by al-ru'ya, seeing the hilal, the crescent moon, we mean by this what? Knowledge. وَذَلِكَ يَحْصُلُ بِقَوْلِ عَدْلٍ وَاحِدٍ. And how is it that knowledge is acquired of the crescent moon being present? He says, through the seeing of it by one person who is considered to be adil, someone who is reliable. And so this is the question, who is considered to be reliable and unreliable, etc. And what does that look like in today's time, today's context? And just on that point, every year we seem to have the Ramadan wars, where we are arguing and debating about whether Ramadan has started or hasn't started, and so on and so forth. And for us, we should just fast when the Muslims fast. Fast with the jama'ah, with the general masses of the Muslims. We don't fast in order to fight and disunite, etc. No, so we fast with the majority of Muslims in our country. When they start, we start. When they end, we end. And for those of us that have local masajid, we can rely upon our local masajid for this issue, because it's not an issue for the general public to be discussing and to be debating and to be trying to come to some sort of conclusion about. It's a matter of ijtihad. And then he says, ولا يثبت هلال شوال إلا بقول عدلين احتياطا للعبادة. As for the month that precedes Ramadan, Shawwal, it is not sufficient to start that month except if we have seen two people have seen the crescent moon of Shawwal. Why? Because we want to make sure that we do not miss out on the ibadah. We don't want to accidentally exit the month of Ramadan early. Therefore, we rely upon two individuals to leave Ramadan and one individual to enter into the month of Ramadan. Then he says, الثاني النية. The second obligation for fasting the month of Ramadan, and fasting generally depending on the type, is النية, the intention. He says, ولا بد لكل ليلة من نية مبيتة معينة. And there has to be an intention which comes before the fasting, i.e. the night before the day of fasting, and it has to be specific. So he's going to clarify. فلو نوى أن يصوم شهر رمضان دفعة واحدة لم يكفه وهو الذي عنينا بقولنا كل ليلة. He says, if a person has the intention in the beginning of Ramadan, I'm going to fast the entire month, it's not sufficient. This person has to have the intention prior to every day of the month of Ramadan. Now, you will find a difference of opinion in this issue. And we have to bear in mind that the author here, Al-Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala, and Imam, he is basing this upon the Shafi'i school. And a person might say, okay, how do I know if I have the intention every night? If you are getting up to eat prior to the fasting starting, then that's an intention. You wouldn't wake up to eat unless you are fasting the next day. So that's the intention. And then he says, الثالث الإمساك عن إيصال شيء إلى الجوف عمدا مع ذكر الصوم. He says the third point is that a person must refrain from allowing anything to reach his internal parts, i.e. the internal parts of his body, more so the digestive parts of the body. He says عمدا مع ذكر الصوم, in a state of remembering that he is fasting and doing so intentionally. So if a person puts something into his mouth and swallows it, and this thing is usually consumed, and he is doing so intentionally whilst fasting, then he's broken his fast. He says فَيُفْسِدُ صَوْمَهُ بِالْأَكْلِ وَالشُّرْبِ وَالسُّعُوتِ وَالْحُقْنَةِ. And so a person breaks his fast, well, if he eats, if he drinks, if he sniffs something, or if he for example, has an injection or has something which is administered into his body which provides nourishment. ولا يفسد بالفصد والحجامة والاكتحال وإدخال الميل في الأذن. And it is not broken through bloodletting, blood cupping, they call it wet cupping, applying kuhul. Likewise, through if someone were to place something into their ear and pull it out, it doesn't break the fast. Why? Because you're not entering something into the body. You're not entering something into the digestive system. Then he says, فأما ذكر الصوم أو مع ذكر الصوم. So فأما ذكر الصوم فأردنا به الاحتراز عن الناس. And he says, مع ذكر الصوم. So this person remembers that he's fasting. He says, why do we mention this? Because the person who is forgetful hasn't broken his fast. So he says, فإنه لا يفطر. أما من أكل عامدا في طرفي النهار ثم ظهر له أنه أكل نهارا بالتحقيق فعليه القضاء. As for someone who has broken his fast, why? Because he ate too late or ate too early, i.e. he woke up and he's eating his suhoor and he assumed that Fajr hasn't come in. Fajr comes in, he continues to eat, and then he realizes that he has continued to eat after Fajr has come in, but he didn't do so purposefully. Or he breaks his fast early. He thinks the adhan has gone off, he eats, and then he realizes, no, the adhan hasn't gone off yet. This person has to make up his fast. Why? Because there is a difference between this person and the one who is forgetful. The one who is forgetful, he's in a state of ghafla. But this person, he hasn't given the fasting time its due diligence. So there is a deficiency on his behalf. And then he says, الرابع الإمساك عن الجماع وإن جامع ناسيا لم يفطر وإن جامع ليلا أو احتلم فأصبح جنبا لم يفطر. He says the fourth thing that a fasting person has to stay away from is what? Intimacy. And he says, so if he is intimate in the daytime intentionally whilst fasting, then he has broken his fast. If he does so and he has forgotten that he's fasting, he is intimate in a state of forgetfulness, and Allah knows best how that can happen, then he hasn't broken his fast. And he says, وَإِنْ جَامَعَ لَيْلًا أَوْ احْتَلَمْ. If he is intimate at night time, or he has a wet dream, then he hasn't broken his fast, or he hasn't corrupted his fasting, even if he wakes up in a state of janaba, and he wakes up after Fajr. Meaning it's not a condition that a person is in a state of ritual impurity in order for his fasting to be valid at the beginning of the day. Let's say, for example, Fajr time comes in and this individual has been intimate with his spouse during the night. And he doesn't have a shower, he doesn't perform ghusl prior to Fajr coming in. Why? Because he's having suhoor. After the adhan comes in, he goes and he has his shower. His siyam is correct. It's valid. There's no issue there. He says, الخامس الإمساك عن الاستمناء ولا يفطر بقبلة زوجته ولا بمضاجعتها ما لم ينزل. He says the fifth is that a person refrains from any intended way of the emission of seminal fluid. So any intended means of emission of seminal fluid whilst fasting invalidates the fast. So it's not just intimacy. It's anything which leads to the emission of seminal fluid done purposefully whilst fasting invalidates one's fast. And of course, for both men and women. He says, وَلَا يُفْطِرُ بِقُبْلَةِ زَوْجَتِهِ. But he does not invalidate his fast by kissing his wife. Likewise, the wife kissing her husband doesn't invalidate the fast. وَلَا بِمُضَاجَعَتِهَا. Likewise, by laying next to her. So a husband and wife laying with each other, laying next to each other, etc. Even if they are laying close to each other, it doesn't break the fast so long as there is no emission of seminal fluid. And when we say seminal fluid, that we're not talking about pre-seminal fluid. We're not talking about pre-seminal fluid. We're talking about seminal fluid, i.e. that which is emitted when a person ejaculates. And forgive me for being so blunt and crude, but it's a place of learning, and sometimes we have to be straight to the point in order to learn things correctly. And then he says, لكن يكره ذلك. It's disliked that a person lays next to his wife إلا أن يكون شيخا, unless he is old in age, i.e. his desire is no longer strong, أو مالكا لإربه, or he is a person who has control over himself. If there is no risk, basically, of being intimate with the spouse whilst fasting, no problem of laying next to each other. But if there is even the slightest risk, it should be avoided. He says, فَلَا بَأْسَ بِالتَّقْبِيلِ وَتَرْكُهُ أَوْلَى. And, excuse me, there is no harm in one kissing their spouse, but avoiding it is better. And then he says, السادس الإمساك عن إخراج القي فالاستقاء يفسد الصوم. He says the sixth point is that a person avoids making himself vomit. If I am fasting and I force myself to vomit, it breaks the fast. He says, فالاستقاء يفسد الصوم وإن درعه القيء لم يفسد صومه. But if the person is overcome by his vomit, i.e. the person vomits, they have no choice in the matter, then the fasting is still valid. And that's a common question, especially people often ask, usually because they've eaten too much, unfortunately for suhoor, that they have acid reflux. And sometimes something can come all the way up to the mouth and it goes back down. They say, have I broken my fast? No, because that's something that is basically overcoming you. It's not something you can control. And so there's no, it doesn't break the fast. Then he says, لوازم الإفطار. So the consequences of breaking one's fast. وأما لوازم الإفطار فأربعة. There are 4 consequences to breaking one's fast. The 4 categories. Number 1, al-qada. So the first is that a person has to make up that which they have missed or broken. Number 2, al-kafara. So they have to give a penalty. They have to pay a penalty or an action which is considered to be a penalty for breaking the fast. Number 4, he says, وَإِمْسَاكُ بَقِيَةِ النَّهَارِ al-fidya. So fidya and kafara, both similar. He says, وَإِمْسَاكُ بَقِيَةِ النَّهَارِ تَشْبِيهًا بِالصَّائِمِينَ. And the 4th category is that a person refrains from eating or drinking for the rest of the day, even though they are not fasting. Why? To emulate the fasting people. So he says, أَمَّا الْقَضَاء. When is it that a person has to make up the fast? فَوُجُوبُهُ عَامٌ عَلَى كُلِّ مُسْلِمٍ تَرَكَ الصَّوْمَ بِعُذْرٍ أَوْ بِغَيْرِ عُذْرٍ. He says it is a general ruling for any Muslim who has left off fasting, whether they were excused or inexcused. So if I, for example, I traveled and I legitimately broke my fast, I still have to make it up. And if a person, may Allah protect us from disobeying Allah, but if a person intentionally broke their fast for no valid reason, they have to make the fasting up. So in that sense, we're the same. Of course, that person is sinning, whereas the person who travels is not. He says, فَالْحَائِضُ تَقْضِيَ الصَّوْمِ. The menstruating woman makes up her fast, the fasting that she's missed. وَكَذَا الْمُرْتَدْ. Likewise, the person who leaves Islam and comes back has to make up any fasting that they missed out. May Allah protect us. Then he says, وَأَمَّا الْكَافِرُ وَالصَّبِيُّ وَالْمَجْنُونَ فَلَا قَضَاءَ عَلَيْهِمْ. As for the young person, as-sabi, غير بالغ, the one who has not reached the age of puberty, والمجنون, and the majnoon person, the one who has lost their capacity to understand, i.e. they are insane, they have lost their sanity. فلا قضاء عليهم. They don't have to make up any fast. So if a person is fasting and then they lose their mind, this person doesn't have to make up the fast. Why? Because they've lost their mind. They become insane. Then he says, وَلَا يُشْتَرَطُ التَّتَابُعُ فِي قَضَاءِ رَمَضَانِ. It is not a condition for the acceptance of that which you make up of fasting that it is done consecutively. I do not have to fast consecutively in order for the fasting, i.e. the fasting I'm making up, to be valid. Then he says, وَلَكِنْ يَقْضِي كَيْفَ شَاء. But the person makes it up however he likes, مُتَفَرَّقًا وَمَجْمُوعًا, whether spread out or all together. And so many pregnant women, for example, they find it very difficult to fast in the summer. Previously, what would they do? They would make it up in the winter periods. They wait until the winter periods, make it up, because it's easy then. But as for the one who's healthy, they have the choice. They can make it up, some here, some there. They can do it all at once. They can do it spread out. He says, وَأَمَّا الْكَفَّارَةِ. As for that which the penalty that should be paid, basically, he says, فَلَا تَجِبُ إِلَّا بِالْجِمَاعِ وَمَا عَدَاهُ فَلَا تَجِبُ بِهِ كَفَّارَةً. He says it is only when a person has been intimate whilst fasting, and other than that, there is no kafara. Kafara is basically an expiation. So an expiation for sin. So the expiation for being intimate whilst fasting is what? He's going to mention, to fast 2 months, or to free a slave, or to give 60 people, to feed 60 people, in the order of freeing a slave, fasting 2 months consecutively, or feeding 60 people. But here there is a difference of opinion. The Shafi'iyya and likewise the Hanabila, they do not believe that there is a kafara, there is an expiation for breaking the fast except for intimacy whilst fasting. As for the Ahnaf, there is an expiation, there is a kafara for breaking the fast through any illegitimate means, unless there is a shubha, unless there is a doubt about the breaking of the fast, i.e. the person had a doubt or something like this, which we can't go into now because it's not a fiqh class. And those that have gone through it in fiqh, they will understand. So the Ahnaf say that if a person eats or drinks illegitimately whilst fasting, there's a kafara. And that shows the severity of not fasting the month of Ramadan. It's a severe act. So he says, والكفارة عتق رقبة فإن أعصر فصوم شهرين متتابعين وإن عجز فإطعام 60 مسكينا مدا. He says, so if a person needs to expiate, what do they have to do? Free a slave. If they cannot do that, they have to fast 2 months consecutively. If they cannot do that, then they have to feed 60 people. And so in our time today, Alhamdulillah, I mean, slavery still exists, but it is very, very, very uncommon and rare in the traditional sense. And so a person cannot free a slave, generally speaking. There are certain countries where it's said that slave trade still exists. And so if that's the case, a person should free the slaves as much as possible. But there are different types of slavery today. So, for example, there are slave trades, which I don't want to go into the details about, but they involve bringing people over and trapping them into certain types of work, and so on and so forth, related to drugs, related to, Allahul Musta'an, prostitution, related to similar acts, but through digital mediums. So there was an article recently, a hotel owner said that many of the hotels in many countries are actually used by slave traders for explicit mediums of entertainment. And I think it makes it clear what I'm talking about. This is a form of slavery. And so these things exist. When people are brought over as illegal migrants, many of them are brought over into a type of slavery. They have to work their way out of that agreement. And many of them are abused and they are mistreated and so on and so forth. And so, not saying that we can try to find these people and that will suffice us legally within the framework of Islam, no. But when we say that slavery no longer exists, it exists in many forms. But perhaps not the traditional form that is usually being referred to when a person says slavery. Then he says, وَأَمَّا إِمْسَاكُ بَقِيَّةِ النَّهَارِ فَيَجِبُ عَلَى مَنْ عَصَى بِالْفِطْرِ أَوْ قَصَرَ فِيهِ وَلَا يَجِبُ عَلى الْحَائِضِ إِذَا طَهَرَتْ إِمْسَاكُ بَقِيَّةِ أَوْ إِمْسَاكَ بَقِيَّةِ نهارها. So he says, as for the refraining from eating or drinking for the rest of the day, then basically it's upon the one who has sinned by breaking their fast. Let's say a person says, I can't do this, and has a drink some water or whatever it is, tea, coffee, eat something. They still have to refrain from eating and drinking for the rest of the day. And some of the fuqaha, they will even go so far as to say the person who is traveling, once they arrive, they should do the same once they arrive at the land of residence. Likewise, the person who the menstruating woman, she should do the same if she becomes pure during the day, etc. So there's a difference of opinion about who this is relevant to, but this is called adab, akhlaq. It's akhlaq. Today, Allahumma musta'an, you see Muslims that are eating and drinking publicly during the month of Ramadan with absolutely no shame. Whereas previously, the Muslims that were permitted to break their fast, they would do so away from the people out of shame of the fact that they're unable to fast. So he says, وعلى المسافر إذا قدم مفطرا من سفر بلغ مرحلتين ويجب الإمساك إذا شهد بالهلال عدل واحد يوم الشك. So he says that likewise the traveling person, when they arrive at the place of residence, they should abstain from eating and drinking as soon as they arrive, emulating the fasting people, but they still have to make up the fast. And then he mentions, depending on the distance that they've been traveling, of course, and he says, وَيَجِبُ الْإِمْسَاكِ إِذَا شَهِدَ بِالْهِلَالِ عَدْلٌ وَاحِدٌ يَوْمَ الشَّكِّ. And it's also upon those who see the crescent moon on a day of doubt, i.e., it's not possible to see the moon because of the clouds, etc., and then we see it, we have to refrain from eating and drinking for the rest of the day. Why? Due to the sanctity of the month. Then he says, وَأَمَّا الْفِدْيَةُ فَتَجِبُ عَلَى الْحَامِلِ وَالْمُرْضِعِ إذا أفطرتا خوفا على والديهما أو على ولديهما لكل يوم مد حنطة أو لكل يوم I believe مد حنطة لمسكين واحد مع القضاء. So as for the fidya, it is something which is compulsory upon the hamil, the pregnant lady, and the suckling lady, i.e. the lady who is feeding via breast milk. If they break their fast out of fear for their child, so it's permissible for a pregnant lady and a lady who is breastfeeding to break their fast or to abstain from fasting if they fear that fasting is going to harm their child. How is that possible? For the fasting, the pregnant lady, perhaps it's obvious. For the breastfeeding lady, how can it harm her child if she is unable to produce enough milk because she's not eating enough? So it's permissible for her to break her fast, and they have to pay fidya. He says, لِمِسْكِينٍ وَاحِدٍ مَعَ الْقَضَاءِ. For one poor person every day, they have to give the fidya, and they also have to make up the days that they have missed. He says, وَالشَّيْخُ الْهَرِيمُ إِذَا لَمْ يَصُمْ تَصَدَّقَ عَنْ كُلِّ يَوْمٍ مُدًّا. He says, as for the elderly man who is unable to fast, likewise the elderly woman, unable to fast due to the weakness of body, they should give every day the charity which is equivalent to a mud in amount. And then he goes on to the sunan. He says, سُنَنُ الصِّيَامِ وَأَمَّا السُّنَنُ فَسِتٌّ.